Why did Endwalker not have a so-called adventuring foray, like Bozja, Eureka or Heavensward's version of the Diadem? What happened to the Relic Grinds, and why is it, when we get content that appears to be clearly grind-worthy, like the V&C Dungeons, that they're intentionally made to be not that grindy? Well, the exact reason we can always speculate on. But a repeating issue with some of these things is that, while they are current, there is a significant amount of players that will begrudgingly do the content while simultaneously voicing their dislike of the content. This, however, typically only happens if there is some sort of gear upgrade associated with it, or, alternatively, a particularly appealing cosmetic item of some sort. For some clear examples of this, back in Stormblood, the relic weapons were, just as they are now, known to eventually be the best weapons in the game by the end of the expansion. As such, if you wanted good equipment, and most players probably do, then you were very heavily incentivized to do whatever it took to get that relic weapon upgraded. This meant that you had to participate in Eureka. This was also amplified by there being decent, but not necessarily best in slot, armor sets to get. As such, a lot of players felt like they had to do Eureka, regardless of whether they enjoyed it or not. Because, after all, this is a multiplayer game, and showing up to content with other players underprepared because 12 forbid you decided to avoid content you found boring in a game you play for fun is not good. Or something. This then leads to a part of the player base voicing their dislike of the content because they feel forced to do it. Simultaneously, anyone who likes the content is much more likely to say nothing, given that they are too busy enjoying the content, leading to a strange situation where the floor is entirely filled with people that don't like the content, leading to a situation where, for example, Eureka appeared to be much more disliked than it actually was when it was current. A similar thing happened with Bozja. In fact, because Bozja had toned down some of the aspects people complained more about, we both got to see players that didn't like Bozja in general, the same from before, as well as players that complained that this was a weaker version of Eureka. Again, as there was some level of expectation to do it because of relic weapons, a lot of players felt forced to do it, despite not liking it. The interesting aftershock of both of these adventuring forays is that once they were no longer current content with the next expansion, the general consensus of the content was that most players liked it. This is of course because, once the content stops being relevant, or those enjoying it run out of stuff to do there, that is when they properly enter the conversation, and potentially are saddened, or even complain, that there is no adventuring foray in Endwalker. At the same time, the players that didn't like the content no longer have much reason to do it at all, and will simply move on. What happens here is of course not because the community has no idea what it wants and just always needs to find a reason to complain about something. This might be obvious to some, but the reality is that by having quite a vast amount of different content and different ways to approach it all, Final Fantasy XIV has a lot of different smaller communities. Some players are only a part of one of them, and some players are part of multiple. For example, a super hardcore raider might be annoyed that they had to participate in Eureka to get the best weapons at the end of the expansion to be able to get the best passes. A mount collector or otherwise more casual player might be very annoyed when a particularly enticing mount is added as a reward for the new Savage Raid tier because of how long they might have to wait before they can get it at a casual pace. And while a PvP player might be very happy to see some incentive to get some more attention on PvP with the PvP series rewards, both of the other players I described might not be super excited to know that there are these exclusive PvP rewards when they don't actually want to do it. The reason why this can become a problem is because it turns out that the people actually making the game listens to player feedback through different avenues. So while we can't know for sure, it is absolutely a possibility that adventuring forays were scrapped from Endwalker after hearing negative feedback about it in Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers. Note, I'm simply using adventuring forays as an example here. This gets extra confusing when we introduce the concept of enjoying doing content you don't enjoy for the sake of the journey. It is not unusual for games to have tedious mechanics that the player base simply puts up with for the sake of the rest of the game. And sometimes the experience wouldn't have been improved by removing the tedium. Yes, it would be way easier if we could simply create a character with all the jobs at max level, ready to play right from the get-go. It would be less tedious if the journey was made much shorter. On the other hand, most of us cherish and appreciate our characters and what we accomplished on them far more because of the tedium and the challenges, because of the journey. Usually these kinds of challenges and tedium come about organically, and it isn't always the case that players dislike the journey. However, it gets quite interesting when we look at Endwalker and Relic weapons. In Final Fantasy XIV, it has always been a tradition that the Relic weapons are quite tedious to get and upgrade. However, once they're finished at the end of an expansion, they are the most powerful weapons in their expansion, making them worth the journey. In A Realm Reborn, Heavensward and Shadowbringers, they involve doing specific content and a significant amount of farming for each upgrade step, a tedious process. That is not to say that this wasn't the case in Stormblood. Those relic weapons simply had all of their grind situated in Eureka, with Shadowbringers simply offering an alternative for many of the Bozja steps. A side effect of these relic weapons being somewhat specific with what you have to do to upgrade them, this can sometimes make the weapons extremely difficult to make once the expansion stops being current, especially if the tasks required cannot be soloed easily. Take for example the resistance weapons from Shadowbringers, where you both need to progress through Bozja, which is extra difficult if there aren't a lot of players. Do Castrum Legislatore, Delubrum Reginae, progress through Zadnor, and do the Dalriada. The grinding parts can mostly be done without making use of Bozja or Zadnor at all. However, just becoming eligible to do that can be very difficult on some worlds depending on how popular the content is. So this was fixed in Endwalker by making the requirement a mostly soloable storyline as a prerequisite, and then you simply pay tomestones. While a lot of players have appreciated the convenience of the Endwalker relic weapons being very easy to farm because of this, a similarly large number of players were very disappointed that they weren't set on a big long tedious grind. A part of this also stems from players simply wanting something they can do in the game they enjoy. And mindlessly farming something to progress a relic weapon is still something more than nothing. But this just goes to show that even if players might not like a certain kind of content, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't still want it. Which leads me to the last weird perspective on content I wanted to talk about. Variant and Criterion Dungeons, or V&C Dungeons for short. Variant dungeons are dungeons for 1 to 4 players that have 12 different endings to discover, which awards a mount if you get all 12. And each clear gives you some tokens to buy rewards for. Throughout the dungeons, certain minions and furniture can also be found. Overall, this gives players reason to do a variant dungeon about a dozen to a few dozen times depending on how many rewards they want. But after that, the content is essentially no longer interesting. At least in terms of rewards. Criterion dungeons are extreme or higher difficulty, 4-man versions of the variant dungeons, restructured as a single dungeon with super difficult versions of the same bosses. This goes even further beyond for Criterion Savage dungeons, where the exact same dungeon is cranked up even harder. A somewhat common complaint about specifically the Savage version of the dungeon was that players were disappointed that the reward structure offered them very little to no reason to run the content again after the first clear, meaning that there was effectively a minor problem that there was no incentive to grind the content, especially since the players enjoyed it at the end of the day. I would have said that the third V&C dungeon, Alo Alo Island, solved this problem. However, the farmable reward is mainly a token that can be exchanged to upgrade the upgraded version, Savage only, of the Tomestone weapons, 500 weekly Tomestones, meaning that to even spend the token, you needed to invest resources you might not be particularly interested in investing, as this special upgraded weapon is effectively a glamour option if you already have the P12S weapon. This is significant as Criterion Savage is often considered harder than Savage raids. In other words, for the most part, many players want to be challenged and put on journeys, at times even journeys that aren't particularly fun for the sake of the accomplishment. But these players also want to be appropriately rewarded for the journey. Very reasonable. And will not be doing content that does not compensate appropriately, even if they do enjoy it. Having tedious content that can be worked at without too much effort, as in the example of relic weapons in particular, seems to be an important part of the game for a lot of players. Even if the same players might complain about this content when they have to do it. Weirdly, it is about having a tedious journey we can all hate together. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, as a result of the customizability and quantity of stats of the Shadowbringers relic weapons, they are generally used as the best in-slot weapon for Stormblood ultimates. Assuming that the final step of the Endwalker relic weapons are equally customizable, they will take over this spot once the final stage of the Mandeville weapons is attainable.